Hi and welcome to the final part of the video series. So today we're going to be turning this into a cap. So this is the final section. So the cap is by far the easiest part, I feel. There's really only one set of threads to be turned inside it, and a hole, and then turned the outside. So we've got our piece of diamond cast, so this is our point we want sticking out. So we'll get that mounted. Now collet chuck. Nice and tight. First thing we need to do is square up the end. So again, I use my carbide barrel trimmer, but you can do it with a parting tool. So even if you think your cut is nice and square, you should always square it up, because I can guarantee you, no matter how square you think your cut is off a saw, is that it's not square enough for as on the lathe. Also, by doing it on the lathe, you'll get it done relative to your hole, which is the most important thing, rather than relative to the rest of the material when you're cutting it. So just a quick touch there, basically to get it square. Again, it's got the button in the middle, but we're going to drill through that, so that's fine. So I start with the next size up, centre bit. So you can see I use these for every single hole that I start drilling in a material, just to make sure I'm getting it nice and square. So just enough to get it started. So first drill bit we'll use is a 31/64, which is about 12.1 millimeters or something like that. Basically it needs to be enough for the threads on the inside, so it's makes the correct diameter hole for the threads, but then it also makes, I need to drill it through to about this mark, which is the length of the mandrel shaft, so they can sit on there, and this matches up with that pretty closely. So again, WD-40, and we drill. So, as you've noticed, a large percentage of Kitless pen making is drilling. Lots of different drill bits, which is why, notice that I said we need so many drill bits. So I like to taper the inside of the barrel sides down a bit, just so you get a little bit more material as you go further down, because you end up with a 12mm diameter hole all the way through. Limits your shapes and sizes a bit as you shape your barrel. So I'll do it through to here, and then I'll use an 11mm and a 10mm bit for the last to shape it down a bit. So you got nice colourful drill tailings or shavings, whatever you want to call them, and the diamond cast. Take it nice and slow. You'll be getting nice clean cuts. If you ever have a sort of semi-transparent material, this is where you really want to make sure that you get it cut cleanly. This is where the resin sort of ends up the thinnest of any part of the pen, really, so you'll see through it. This diamond cast though is not transparent at all, so that's not an issue. But it's also a big enough hole that you can see inside it reasonably easily. So we go up to about that hole. As long as we go to the hole or a little bit past, it doesn't matter, it doesn't need to be too accurate at that depth as long as it's longer. So next one is an 11mm bit. I've got a mark on there roughly, approximately where I want to go to. Again, this isn't super critical, I just want it to be tapering down, but I don't want to go straight down to a 10mm bit. So I just need to drill 4 or 5mm or so. Let's put that red line. Now next one I'm using a 10mm bit. So this depth is very critical. So basically it needs to be enough to fit in the nib. So from the shoulder here to the nib, that's what screws on. But obviously if you go too far, you'll have less. If you go too far, obviously you go through the material, not enough, and the nib will catch on the end. So I think that's about 51, 52mm. So I'll generally go to about 57 inside there, and then give us about 3 or 4mm of extra material for here. So about 52mm up to there roughly. But again, this depends on the length of that you made. So yeah, so it's always a good idea to measure that to make sure. So this one's about 51.2. So yeah, so I'll go to about 56, 57. So make sure you're doing it from the tip of the drill bit, not the wing. And then yep, so I've got my line on there. Always got to either check that. Tighten this up, it gets a little bit loose because it's not a solid object anymore, the drill bit's gone through. Pop that in there. So generally I'm aiming for my cap final dimensions to be 61, 62mm. So that gives, by drilling about 57mm, gives you about 4mm on the top, which is more than enough. And the last thing I do is drill with a 14mm bit. So this makes a tiny little recess on the outside here, where the threads only don't cut quite to the end. So you can either have a recess on here, which I hate the look of personally, or you can put your recess in the cap here, which I think looks much better. So that way that the cap will screw all the way on. Only needs to be a couple of millimeter deep. We also need to bear in mind when I drill it that we'll sand and polish this front end here. So we'll lose about 1/4 millimeter or something there as well. So just stop and check, tiny bit further. If I go too far, I can always sand it off if I'm not happy with it. Which is why it's always good to make sure your blank is a little bit longer. So your next step would be to cut the threads, but the material is still quite hot from all the drilling, and you don't want to be cutting threads while it's hot. So what I'll do now is actually polish and sand the end of this, and so by the time I've done that, the material will have cooled down a bit, and the application of the water will help a little bit with that as well. So sanding, it's good to get a nice clean surface on here. This will be one that you'll see on the finished product. So I start with a 400 and 600mm of these craft sanding, not 400mm grit, these pads, and then I'll do the micro mesh. So I'll make sure I get it a bit wet. 750, and then make sure you're keeping it nice and square. And you want to remove the marks from either your parting tool or the carbide cutter. So again, no matter how clean you think you're doing it, it's not clean enough for this. So always check it before we move on. A bit more. You don't want to take off too much because then all the other holes that you drill will be inaccurate. Okay, so we've got 600s. I use these rather than the micro mesh because it's just a nice stiff pad. So they're actually craft for like model working sanding pads. They come from like 400 through to 7,000. So I use them for this step. They last quite a while as long as you clean them up. And then I'll just use a micro mesh. So the reason I don't use the micro mesh for the shaping is that it is quite flexible. Don't need to spend a whole lot of time on this. Obviously we're going to turn this diameter down a bit later. There won't be very much material showing, but you still need to have a nice finish on it. And last one. A little bit of buff with paper towel, a little bit shiny. Use a bit of polish if you really wanted to. Feel that it's nice and smooth with your finger. Yeah, there we go. And I've filled materials cooled down enough now that we can cut threads. So we have our M13 by 0.8 triple start. That goes into the Jacob's chuck. So we need to have enough threads to cover it's about 5 or 6 millimeters of the barrel for it to screw in, plus also the mandrel. The mandrel only has about the same as the thing, so as long as we go in about 5 or 6 millimeters, that's enough. So again, generous amount of WD-40. Line that up. Again, you want it loose in here. Tailstock there, and then sort of like push it on so it bites, and then do the backwards and forwards with the 2 hands. So because it's triple start, it really sort of pulls it in quickly, so you get through the threads quicker than you realise. If it's not tight enough, it'll start to turn the piece. So I can judge by how much has gone out here on the tailstock when I need to stop. And that should be well more than enough. Doesn't matter if you go too far in. If it's a completely non-transparent material, doesn't matter if you go too far in. If it's slightly transparent, then obviously you only want to have as enough threads as you can possibly get away with, because you'll be able to see it from the outside. So just run it through again, just clean it up. Make sure we've got clean cuts and sort of feel it's cutting slightly a little bit more material, but not much. And just clean up some of that WD-40. Now I'll always remove my nib section for my first test. So I just need to test fit. So make sure it goes in nice and smoothly. Twist this to make sure that stays nice and flat, doesn't move. Means you've got everything nice and square. You want it to go in sort of firmly but not loosely. But you don't want to be having to like twist it too hard, so it's sort of a delicate fit. If it's too tight, we can drill a little bit more out with that 40mm bit, or we can also use diamond file or something similar, or a bit of sandpaper, and sand down these threads a bit more, and that can help loosen it up a little bit if it's a bit too tight. The other thing is, if you're wanting to line up the barrel with the cap, this is when you can adjust that. So the way you adjust that is by sanding down this surface. So if you were needing to have that lined up, you wouldn't have sanded that beforehand. You would have waited until after you cut threads. The thing to remember though is that it's a triple start, so there are 3 different positions that this will line up in. So even though you'll get it lined up with one, the other 2 it won't. So if you're really needing it lined up for every single time, then that's when you really need to be using a single start threads. So all we need to do now is turn it to shape. So just we need to attach our mandrel on. So we've got our smaller collet chuck. So again, make sure that's all nice and clean. Turn on the hand and tighten. And make sure it's nice and tight. If it's not, going to keep trying. So it can be a good idea to measure the depth of your hole just so you're aware of how deep it is. So mine's about 57mm. So obviously you want to make sure that when you're turning the end off, that you get that right. So feed that on there, give it a twist. Sometimes you'll get more wobble, and you can try one of the other starts and get it working a little bit better. So line up our live center. So my blank is about 70mm long, so the point will go in 1mm or 2. You'll have a little bit of waste, and then I'll turn it down to about 61-ish. So it'll be about there somewhere. Barrel is by far the easiest part. Shape-wise, the bigger mandrel really holds it on, so a bit more firmer than the other 2. So you're much less likely to have any problems turning, but obviously you still need to be careful. It's not held as securely as on a proper pen mandrel. Stop, give a measure. A few measurements that I'm aiming for. It's about 14-ish and 16 up here. So my spot on. Yep. So I see it give it the shape I want. Barrel's by far the quickest part to turn. So then I need to measure. So I'm at 61mm. Start it off. So again, I want to match the curve from the end of the barrel. holds it on much more firmly, so you can do more with this rather than the sandpaper. And then we've got that all done. So all we need to do now is sand and polish and give that some nice shape. Okay, so just need to sand and polish this. So again, I start at 400. The important part is to get the shape nice and smooth on this end here. So it'll clean it up a lot more with my parting tool than I could the barrel. So you can feel it feels nice and smooth. So double check. And then I'll just do the rest. Again, obviously the shape is completely your decision. I've evolved my shape to be what it is now. Just have to bear in mind the size of your hole on the inside. Starts off at about 12 millimeters all the way through and goes down to about 10, sort of somewhere here, so you don't want to go any narrower than that. At this end needs to be, obviously you've got the 14 millimeter hole, so you want at least 15.5 millimeters right at the very tip. Otherwise it'll just be too thin. So run your finger along it, make sure there's no divots or anything like that. Always check it. Beautiful rainbow. Sand backwards and forwards. The end as well. And we're all done. So I basically take it off and we're finished. So only thing now to do is put it all together. And make sure you test all your fits. And we have one completed pen. So nice beautiful material this. The stainless steel gold plated Joe nib, and it's all done. It'll post a little bit. If I really want it to post, I will go narrower there, but I didn't want that on this one really. And we're done. So thank you for watching. My motivation for making these videos was based on the RJB Woodturners videos, which I know a lot of us Kitless pen makers have learnt from. I felt like I could just improve the context slightly and also explain how I make it from an Australian pen turner's point of view, based on materials and equipment available here. This is my first ever YouTube videos, so I don't know how well these are going to edit together, and it's just filmed all on my phone, so certainly not professional, but I hope it's well enough that some other aspiring pen makers can get some information from it, or also any of my customers if they're interested to know how these pens are made. If you have any questions about any of the processes or anything I did, please feel free to leave it in the comments, and I might do another video answering questions if there's enough. So like I said, this is my way of making a bespoke Kitless pen. There are many other ways of doing it. This is my way that I've developed over about 300 odd pens, and that works for me. So thank you very much.